Okay, cool. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers whose work we broadly think is relevant to rethink the question of the animal in connection to various aspects of their lives. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective, and my co-host, Dr. Anu Pandey from EFLU, is also here. I'm Susan Harris. I'm a PhD student at IIT Delhi. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animals in India so that we can think about what an Indian animal studies would look like, what its constituents might be, and so on. For today, we have with us Jacob Doherty of the University of Edinburgh. We are here to discuss his forthcoming book, Waste Worlds, Inhabiting Kampala's Infrastructures of Disposability. Thanks, Jacob, for accepting our invitation and more importantly, for sharing your book with us. Please feel free to ask a question or comment at any point. Just unmute yourself or raise a hand or put the question in the chat box, or you can just speak up. I thought we could begin the discussion by maybe you could just talk about why you thought, what I found really interesting about the book is that is the twinning of development and disposability. While a lot of people have written about waste in connection to development, you were also connected to disposability and infrastructures, and also situated in the realm of the future, in the realm of the potential and of future aspirations and so on. So why did you think it was important to make this connection to disposability?
Sure. Thanks. Just before I answer, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure. I was just saying this is one of the first audiences that I've had a chance to share and talk about the book with. So I'm really grateful to you for showing your interest and having the chance to have this conversation. That's a really important question to think about. And part of it has to do with a kind of reading a lot of the literature that was using the concept of disposability as I was sort of preparing to do the research, found it often understood primarily as a form of exclusion, such that then sort of disparate forms of social inclusion would be the recipe for thinking about sort of undoing disposability or challenging the conditions that lead to disposability. And I think what really came out through the research is that development is a sort of form of inclusion. It's a sort of way of producing new forms of social collectivity and all sorts. It's the rhetoric in Kampala is very much about including uplift and all of these kind of stories. But rather than kind of undoing it, these kind of exacerbated and reproduced or produced in new forms, different regimes of disposability. And so thinking about the actual nature of what a disposable commodity is and really rooting it in what the kind of material histories of these things, how they come out of histories of sort of actual material abundance, the possibilities afforded by the fossil fuel industry and the sort of plastics industries that sort of make it cheaper to produce new things that could be thrown away rather than relying on the arts of repair or other sort of embodied forms of habitus that have shaped how people relate to the material world and objects throughout. This is really imagined as a form of progress and a form of development, and so materially disposability sort of is an effect of these kind of things rather than one of inclusion, one of exclusion. It's really it's about how things come to be included and then discarded rather than this kind of straightforward story about people being outside of the social or outside of capitalism.
Yeah, I thought the difference between the book and the article that I had first read was that it becomes really evident while you're reading parts of the book that in the ethnographic interviews and so on, you can really see how these people really have this vision in mind of bringing together people, of uplifting these people, and also have some kind of a national vision in mind. But I was also thinking about how you position the book towards and oriented towards waste worlds, which kind of suggests this plurality or multiplicity. So is there a contradiction between this vision that these people in power have for the nation, and at the same time, the different creatures and the different beings that inhabit these waste worlds?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that's definitely the case. I think the dominant image of the future of Kampala at the time I was doing my fieldwork was this kind of idea of a clean and green city that was premised on sort of tackling a lot of the environmental and sanitation challenges that the city's facing, improving the conditions of living for the urban majority. And the rhetoric behind this is really powerful, and a lot of the visions that people that come from this are quite incredible. But what you found sort of attending to the actual sort of practices of cleaning on a day-to-day basis, these kind of exercises where one of the kind of main sites that I studied were these cleaning campaigns where the municipal government or NGOs would kind of stage a day-long exercise of targeting a specific neighborhood, partnering with stakeholders from the area, be it a church or a school or some kind of youth group, or some different kinds of community organizations that would get volunteers out into the street and sort of target an area and clean it up, right? Sort of get people literally digging into this, the drainage trenches, digging out the silt and rubbish that had accumulated, targeting the backlogs, sort of the areas in between houses where lots of rubbish had built up. And sort of targeting this and sort of bringing it all out into the light, and then parking a big lorry, a big rubbish truck to come and collect it and take it all away. So I think in a way, these kind of reproduced in microcosm the narrative about the future of the city that the municipal government was producing, this idea of through kind of concerted collective action, we can sort of target these things and uplift discrete areas. But one of the things that these revealed is that these are often sort of done in partnerships with companies like the water bottle producing companies. So a lot of it has to do with grappling with waste as a kind of inevitable thing that already exists, or something that we've inherited from the past, rather than something that's constantly being reproduced in the future. And these kind of partnerships with some of the companies that are responsible for producing all sorts of disposable goods and circulating them through the city are sort of an unquestioned part of that. But one of the sort of interesting disjunctures that I noticed participating in all of these was a kind of gap between a lot of the people who were volunteering, who were there cleaning up the events, were people who were volunteering but were coming in from like neighboring areas rather than the residents of the areas themselves, who seemed to be somehow unreachable by the city government, who then would always complain like, oh, the locals aren't really interested, we can't get them to participate. And then the volunteers would come in from sort of neighboring, slightly more affluent areas most of the time, and then have the same discourse about, oh, it's the sort of, look, we're the ones who are cleaning this area. There's the kind of idea that it's a moral failing of the urban poor themselves to uplift themselves and maintain cleanliness. And when you talk to people sort of living in an area, watching this stuff go on, it's sort of like, well, yeah, it's nice that it's clean for a week or so, but without a kind of sustained investment, it goes back to normal. And it's also a lot of people sort of made a comment like, well, yes, but we know what happens when it gets cleaned up, that this is a sort of first, if we get better services, our landlords will start to charge us a little bit more, but we'll be able to afford here if it's clean. And there was a sense that really what makes life in some of these neighborhoods viable is a kind of condition of semi-abandonment that makes it affordable, the lowest conditions. So there was a sort of sense of faith that growth, that material improvements would be equitable, or that would be for them. So there's a kind of very strong hesitancy around upgrading or cleanliness programs that I'm sure is quite familiar from a lot of urban Indian cases as well. So there's this kind of distrust and disjuncture between this vision of the future that I think a lot of people broadly support and would love to live in the kind of city that the Kampala Capital City Authority articulates a vision for, but don't have necessarily faith in the process by which they're going to get there. And that's, I think, one of the things that I learned from thinking about marabou storks, and that I think we can learn about from thinking with animals in this case, is that these kinds of exclusion are also very much a multi-species process, that it's not just kind of the urban residents, the human residents of these kind of neighborhoods, but the kind of ecologies that they sustain are also undergoing dramatic transformations yeah, there's that sort of, even the people in this in the city who are most invested in there being a future for animals there say like, no, if you want to get rid of the birds, you can't cut down the nests. That's inhumane. What we need to do is clean up and do a kind of eradication through cleaning. So yeah, there's definitely a disjuncture there.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing that I noticed is that, you know, on one hand, the waste or these waste worlds, they seem to be considered as this ordinary everyday part of life. Cleaning, getting rid of waste, all that happens on a daily basis. And but there is this overarching framework of this project that these things need to happen so that we can progress towards this future. And especially when you think about the marabou storks who have been living in these spaces for so long and who are part of the garbage ecosystem or something like that, then who exactly is it possible at all? Like you were talking in the book about the urban poor as these people who really, you can't really get rid of them because they're always there. And in the same way, are the marabou storks also outside this narrative in some ways, because it's an ordinary everyday process for them, and the vision is always aimed towards the future and towards people who buy into that vision.
Yeah, I think the vision of the future city, like the municipal vision, doesn't have a place for marabou. So I think they're kind of a very ungainly, a kind of a monstrous figure of a reminder of some of the realities of the present. In a lot of ways, they live in nests in trees that I think are quite desirable, but they're sort of there as evidence of broader problems in governance that are made manifest in waste. So I think there's a lot of other birds that might be much more welcome. The national bird of Uganda is a very beautiful bird called the crested crane that lives in the wetlands on the cities, and those are always, I think those are heralded as signs of healthy wetlands that are doing quite well, and they're, a beautiful bird that's on the national crest and all sorts. So I think they're sort of always figured as part of the future of the city, but the stork is sort of seen as a kind of intruder or a harbinger of bad things in sort of urban. This isn't what sort of the bird's population biology shows, but there's a lot of urban rumors around, like they came into the city in the 70s during the Amin regime, when there were all sorts of political violence was going on. There were bodies in the street, and they came in as these kind of vultures eating human bodies. That's not necessarily what the sort of birds. People study the history of the bird population in the city do, but it sort of indexes their capacity to, or it shows their capacity to index kind of ideas about social malaise, urban crisis, or political problems. They're actually much more, their presence is much more tied to urban growth and the growth of waste sites, but in particular of dumping sites around the city, and growing sort of management of food waste beyond the capacity of the small scale dumping. And the municipal landfill to grow. So I think their growth is really tied to that rather than these other things, but their presence always indicates as a kind of seen as a sense of trouble. So they're not really imagined as part of the future. And I think also, I mean, yeah, part of that is as many of the kind of urban dump sites, as the city does get cleaner, more of the waste management practices are applied, a lot of these backlogs and new kind of sites are cleared up, then yeah, the geography of that they've developed for themselves, or the niche that they've come to occupy, is itself changing. So their future in the city isn't necessarily guaranteed.
Professor Patni, do you want to ask a question? I saw you looking forward.
You've given me a chance. I will ask something. I should explain I'm not an animal studies person, but I'm interested in a couple of the problems that you raised, and I've only read your paper, which I've read in the last half an hour. So I wanted to ask two kinds of questions. The first one has to do with the connection between the notion of disposability and the notion of what you call salvaging and we call recycling here. I I did. When I started reading your piece, one of the things I was struck by was our use of the word para, from which the word pariah comes, which is other. And pariah is always dirty and considered beyond the pale. But that was not my question. My question had to do, as I said, about the connection between recycling and disposability. And I wanted to ask you about a kind of bizarre example, or you might consider it bizarre, which is humans themselves as disposable and waste dumps. So I'm thinking of the case of the Bengali widow. When a woman became widowed in Bengal, she was invisibilized. She had to wear white, and she was above all stopped from eating, eating any food that was cooked in the house, and yet she had to do the cooking. So what she ate was scraps and disposable from the patriarchal table, as it were, and everything else. So she became a person who ingested the waste, the scraps, the vegetable peel, and so on and so forth. And that was her identity as somebody who was a dump, a kind of person who would absorb all the waste that went on. Now, my question here is that this woman, could you consider her? I know you don't want me to romanticize things, but a cross between the storks, who are kind of omnivorous and eat everything, and the salvagers who sort out things into packets and reuse them. So that, you can, the storks, how much agency do they have versus the salvagers, and how do they fit into a picture where you do not have a city, let's say, but you do have the same problems of disposability, and that because this has always existed in human cultures, in a way, the notion that our bodies produce disposable stuff, societies produce disposable stuff, but capitalist societies deal with them in one way, and other kinds of societies dealt with them in another way, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example. I'm not sure I can say very much about the story around Bengali widow specifically, not knowing much beyond what you've just said. But I think there is something really important in what you're saying in the way that there's a big metaphoric tendency in this literature on disposability to sort of think about the human as waste and the way that people are thrown away and expelled and excluded from social space, from inclusion, from recognition, from the social itself. I think one of the things that actually paying attention to disposable commodities and what happens to waste itself shows us is that after consumption, when things are thrown away, that's very rarely the end of their social lives. There's this whole afterlife to commodities that the study of discard has really helped us to understand and to unpack. And so in a way, that's also true for these processes of human disposability, that there is life after this, that it's never a form of total exclusion. It's never a full end, but it's a sort of rich and productive site for the production of all sorts of new kinds of lives and new kinds of social worlds that are challenging and devalued, and sites of incredible injury in all sorts of different ways. So I think the anthropologist of Brazil, Kathleen Miller's written about this in her work on salvaging and landfills in Rio, and the way that waste, the landscapes of waste become a site for undoing disposability, sort of crafting forms of life at the limits of the social, that sort of are a site for producing new forms of inclusion. And I think these kinds of, what for me is quite interesting about this idea about the parasite, and I hadn't made that connection between the para and the pariah before, so thank you for pointing that out. So that's really, I have to do a bit more thinking about that, actually. but I think what I really like about this, that kind of, this idea is the idea of things being alongside and mutually dependent, and the instability of the relation of parasitism, of which is that it's a question of intensity and degree, and it's a kind of relative and relational view. And what marabou stalks and recyclers both, I think, reveal is the way that the kind of official waste management system of the city is never kind of wholly self-sufficient, that it relies on these things that are outside of it, that exist alongside it. And I keep wanting to say in parallel, but it's the connections between them, the fact that they don't run in parallel, but they're sort of fundamentally linked at all of these points, that these exchanges between them, where it's waste pickers' ability to sort of double their daily wage by collecting plastics as they're working on a municipal garbage truck, for example, that allows them to sort of sustain themselves and actually come back to work have enough to sort of sustain themselves, feed their families, and come back to work the next day. So the wage that they earn is supplemented in ways that make their municipal work possible by their engagement with these kind of parasite alongside unauthorized practices. The same with the salvagers who exist at the landfill, who have helped to sustain the life of the landfill. It's sort of at the time I was doing the work, it was about 5 years overdue for overdue for closing, and there's new sites being identified, but it's still in operation. And in part, it's this active work of removing all of this that officially doesn't exist, that's not on any of the books, that the government can't really recognize as a kind of legitimate form of work, but that everyone who works there knows that there's all of these off the books kinds of relations that exist, that extend the life, that sort of remove tons and tons of material, and quite bulky material that doesn't degrade. Right, when you see the sort of the trucks that come to buy this plastic, the sort of volumes of it are quite enormous, even if it's quite light. The volumes of this stuff are really huge, and so it's actually that work that allows the municipal landfill to continue going. So there's all of these kind of functional interdependencies that I think is also really true about disposable commodities, that they're things that we've come to rely on in all sorts of ways. I think the sort of the medical infrastructure of the pandemic has really made this clear, the way that sanitation, cleanliness, that modern hygienic regimes depend on producing all sorts of waste, and that it's something that's kind of constitutive of how we live. In a lot of ways, that it doesn't make sense to think about, again, as a form of exclusion or outside, but something that's kind of integral to living. And this kind of paradox between essential, what's emerged as this kind of paradox between essential worker and disposable people in the pandemic is I think maybe quite closely linked to the question you're asking, to, of people who are dubbed essential for the continued operation, but what your essentialness means is higher degrees of exposure, high degrees of personal risk, and the kind of in the UK context, it's come with a kind of like public lauding, public lionization, at least for the first few months, but then that sort of comes at the cost of deep personal exposure to risk. And I was listening to an interview with a municipal union worker in Philadelphia in the United States, who was saying that it's actually municipal sanitation workers who are the worst struck people in the city of Philadelphia, who are constantly at work, who work in these kind of very small confined spaces that can constantly passing infections around, but are essential to actually keeping the city running. So I think there's this kind of way that people become essential as a class, and within that disposable individually, that I think is really worth unpacking in this concept.
The other really strange, okay, you should ask your question.
Somebody else is asking?
No, I can wait, and maybe after you
No, you go ahead. I have other questions, but they're even more bizarre. So I'll let you ask.
Okay, you should ask them after Sneha's question. Then my question was related to what we were just discussing. And it seems like in these narratives, even in India, it's always certain groups of people and certain animals who are singled out and associated with waste or with garbage. And I was thinking about this, and in the case of marabou storks, you discuss them as creatures who are having a good time feasting on garbage. They, in your own words, they are living in these states of filthy flourishing. So are they singled out because of their intimate associations with waste that they naturally and instinctively cultivate? Or is it that is there a set of values that associate certain creatures and certain beings with waste more than others? Or perhaps is there just a need? I think Mary Douglas would perhaps say something like, there is a need for somebody to be singled out, to be scapegoated, so that the narrative of purity can be constructed.
Yeah, so I think I risk overstating how much attention they get paid in a sort of the general run of everyday Kampala life. I think I probably meet there's a few bird biologists, biologists at Makerere University in Kampala who pay attention to them, and there's an animal, there's a bird, the kind of a tourism and animal rights activist group who does a lot of work around birds in Uganda broadly, and they're based in Kampala, so they work there. But I think other than like the three of us, there's not a huge amount of like culture around them. This was one of the challenges actually that I found in studying them, is that it's not a kind of culturally rich site. They appear in the newspaper every once in a while. You put cartoonists like them because they're quite weird looking and charismatic, so they often appear in the background of cartoons just as a kind of general sign of dirtiness or corruption sometimes. But there isn't a kind of rich culture around them. Like, for example, in Buganda, there's 52 clans who all have animal totems, but they don't feature within this system of animal totems, in part because they're recent migrants. They're not kind of, they've always passed through the area, but they're migratory birds who chase the wet season, or the end of the wet season, when ponds dry up, when wetlands dry up and fish are kind of stranded. They sort of chase that up and down the continent, but they've sort of settled more permanently, and that's a more recent thing. So they don't really feature in the kind of folkloric way that the other kind of animals in the area do. And so this was one of the sort of challenges, is that there's not a kind of rich set of relations around them, and the people who have the kind of strongest everyday interactions with them are people who are groundskeepers, or people who are responsible for keeping areas clean in areas where they nest, because their nests produce a lot of waste. And so if you live underneath one, or you're so for example, the groundskeepers at the university use the grounds to kind of do dry laundry and dry foodstuffs and stuff, and the birds are always interfering with this, and their waste is always interfering with it. So they're often the ones who are poisoning birds, or sort of in this kind of running battle, who have more everyday interactions with them. So my sense is part of why they're very unpopular is their physical appearance is very ungainly. There's very I find them quite captivating, but I think a lot of people are quite repulsed by them. They have these big sacks under their necks. They're very strange looking and disconcerting, and they're big, right? They come up to I'm like fairly tall, and they come up to my chest, and they don't really care about you if you're walking by them. They're not really bothered, and they've got quite big beaks. They look like they could do you a bit of damage. So I think that's part of why. But I think the closer to the kind of Mary Douglas analysis that I'd put is that it's actually their mobilities and their trajectories through the city that become quite problematic, because they chart a geography that refuses a lot of the divisions that mark the city. So their nests are in some of the highest end, the sort of spaces and landscapes associated with wealth and elite. They live in green spaces, they live in treetops, that's where they make their nests. But then their food is in the wetlands and lowlands in the city, or at the landfill, in these very sort of low prestige zones. And their daily movements back for that sort of invert the regular flow of waste through the city and bring waste back in the form of like bird droppings into elite spaces. And so if you'll occasionally see a very like nice car that's just covered in bird droppings, that means someone's parked under one of their nests, and that makes them very unpopular. So it's these kind of it's the way that they literally invert the flow of waste and cleanliness through the city, and sort of cut across these trajectories, the sort of normal divisions of those spaces that are quite securitized in other senses. So it's their mobility, I think, that really does that. And I think one of the things that I've learned from from thinking about them is actually paying attention to those mobilities and the ways that these kind of spaces that are, quite, where the boundaries between them are quite securitized, but they're also very porous, not just for animals who can fly, but also there's all sorts of ways that waste work and the labor of producing cleanliness itself also relies on circulations through these, and that these boundaries are never quite as secure. And I think, again, this is one of the things that Mary Douglas helps us to think about, is these boundary crossings and threshold moments, the ways that they become kind of quite culturally problematic and sites of cultural anxiety where these boundaries have to be reestablished.
Sneha?
Hello, hi, Jacob. Your work was really helpful at the time when not many people were talking about animals as infrastructure, and it really helped me in my. I'm looking at pigs in urban Delhi as infrastructure, and one thing that I wanted to ask you is that we talk about these animals as very important ecologically to the city, and sometimes they occupy such marginal spaces that their importance as importance like in solid waste management. Like I am looking at pigs in informal settlements. Sometimes these pigs are in numbers of hundreds, and they're definitely eating up a lot of solid waste that just gets thrown, and there is not enough sanitation facility. So they definitely help keep the environment clean. But that is not enough stressed by people themselves. Like I never heard people talk about it. Similarly, if you look at conservation, wherever conservation practices are happening, people don't really always talk about how animals are important for certain ecological functions. But where people talk about, you always see a presence of an external, like an NGO or a collective that works with them, that educates them. So I wanted to know, if do people articulate like that in Kampala? Do they, like the waste pickers or the communities that stay around? Did you ever come across them articulating how these animals are important? I mean, in my research, they are important socio-culturally, and they always talk about that. Economically, they're important as liquid assets, and culturally, they're very important. But that ecological importance is something that people don't talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever come across that? And second is, I wanted to know that whenever we visit such people who are working in such areas, the parallels are quite visible to us between people and animals. Be it on, like in my case, in terms of castes, like how in terms of untouchability, in terms of caste, in terms of scavenging, like certain groups of people who were historically termed as scavengers, along with the animals there, who are now scavenging in these areas. So it's very, for us, it's very difficult to not see it that way. And what do you think about that? Like, do you think, what are your views on looking at these parallels and like how to look at them more critically, maybe?
Can you just repeat the Elizabeth, that second bit? I think I lost a little bit in it cut out for a second.
Like we always look at parallels when we talk about, when we are in such settings, like right now we're talking about people and animals scavenging together, and we look at parallels. We try to draw parallels. It cannot escape us. So what do you think about drawing such parallels? Can you, like, what are your views on drawing these parallels? And can you say something that helps us look at these kind of perspectives that we draw more critically?
Yep.
Because we are all the time we're doing that. Like a couple of years back, this was really scarce, but now a lot more people are looking at animals in the urban or like in society and drawing these parallels. What do you think about it?
Yeah. I think in a way, my answer to both questions is quite interlinked. So the people who talk about their ecological importance as such are, as you said, an NGO, and then university researchers who study bird populations nationally. They sort of provide so they're the kind of source for my kind of back of the envelope calculations about how their contribution as waste management infrastructure to the city. So they're the ones who talk about their importance in strictly ecological terms. But linking to your other question, the other people who talk about them are salvagers working at the landfill, where there's like that's the sort of single biggest place where marabou storks live around there, and that's sort of one of the dominant food sources. And that's where there's a few hundred people who work on a day-to-day basis collecting plastics and stuff. The relation, the way that they talked about them was almost as kind of co-workers, like co-present people doing similar parallel work, but interested in quite different material substances. So salvagers aren't interested in anything edible or bio, any kind of biological waste, food waste, anything like that, the kind of stuff that the animals seek out. So people talked about them as being a kind of, there being a complementarity to them, that the birds eat some of the like smellier stuff, the grosser stuff that gets in the way of collecting plastics and cardboard and metals that salvagers work for. So they were seen as sort of providing a helpful, people didn't talk about in terms of ecology, they talked about it more in terms of doing work that is useful for their own work. And I think that's actually a quite useful way to get beyond thinking about this metaphorically or in terms of parallels, is actually seeing co-working and presence together as sort of analyzing or thinking about the work that people do with and alongside animals, rather than sort of writing off a kind of understanding it as a kind of shared social condition, but thinking about it as a shared sort of infrastructural condition or shared working conditions or shared conditions of shared conditions of life. And so thinking about it as shared rather than parallel, or people sort of working relationally and together, and thinking about human and animal relationships rather than human and animal like metaphoric reading of each other, I think is kind of the useful way of doing this. I'm sure if you're interested in pig world, the story of the pigs and waste collectors in Cairo is quite famous one that I think is really useful for thinking about this, of the way that waste pickers in Cairo, this whole waste economy developed around people who were pig keepers, rare Christian pig keepers in a majority Muslim society, who were able to feed all sorts of organic waste to pigs and then keep what was left over for themselves. And then the way that, was it SARS? I'm losing track of pandemics now, but there had to be these huge pig culls at the time that sort of then transformed the whole ecology of waste management in the city that was really reliant on this animal labor. So I think that's one really interesting example for thinking about this, not in terms of parallel, but in terms of co-working and co-production. And then I was teaching this last year, but Alex Blanchette's work on pigs in the United States, and the pig, what he calls the production of the American pig, and the way that this is producing the right kind of pigs for the American food industry is reliant on producing human lives in certain ways, and the ways that diseases pass among themselves, and the way that human lives have to be organized in order to keep pig populations separate, and people working in separate plants can't live together, even if they're kin, even if it's a kind of common family business to sort of everyone working it. If you're working in separate plants, you can't live together. So the way that it's not about parallels between it, it's not about the way that immigrants in this case are treated like pigs in their terms of disposability, or the way that the economy eats them in these kind of metaphoric terms, but it's literally about the ways that managing the biopolitics of a pig population requires a particular kinship geography for humans. And so I guess for my answer to your question is thinking really about the kind of practical material relations and of what working together or living together looks like is for me the way to do it. But I'm very interested to learn more about what you're thinking about too.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting insight. Maybe I'll share my work with you at one point.
Please.
One of the things that I know you try to do in the book is to keep together the material aspects of waste, but also focus on the social symbolic construction of waste. Is it possible to really negotiate these tensions? Because I feel like it is a conceptual category, and how it gets discussed is through other concepts such as spatiality or infrastructure and so on. How is it possible to be really attentive to the materiality of waste? Because I wanted to know in the book itself, what exactly constitutes waste in Kampala? Is it food waste predominantly? Is it, I have no idea.
Yeah, so there's a few things there. I think on the one hand, I'm kind of pushing back on a sort of new materialist or vitalist approach to waste that sort of seeks out the agency of waste itself, or that sort of, in Jane Bennett's terms, seeks to have a non-anthropological account of the material world. That for me, well, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm not particularly interested in that, but I think it gets rid of a lot of precisely what's interesting about thinking about this and what we're capable of doing as kind of human social science analysts of material worlds, is thinking about these things together in the way that, for me personally, it's the kind of moral codings of these things that become really important, and the way that assumptions about the inhabitants of a place are read through its waste management practices, for example. So I think what's necessary is is both, right? I think the purely symbolic Mary Douglas approach doesn't do enough to tell us about ecologies, about more than human worlds, and it sort of leaves out the ways that the specificities of material stuff shapes the ways that symbols are made, the kinds of worlds that emerge around it, the kinds of social life that are produced have a lot to do with the physical affordances of the material in question. But to me, that doesn't sort of lead to the next step being to sort of attribute some kind of vital causality to that necessarily, but or to think of sort of having material properties with the same thing as kind of yeah, or not to think of having material properties with the same thing as having agency. So I think for me, the agency thing is a little bit like, that's not really where I wanted to go with the analysis. It was thinking about precisely how materials, landscapes, people, places, and things kind of come together and shape worlds through their interactions with each other. In terms of the material stuff of garbage in Kampala, I think for the one hand, yeah, waste is very much a category, right? Time is one of the biggest things that people complain about being wasted, but that doesn't have quite the same materiality. But when you I've done a little bit of work on mobilities and transport stuff, but so there everyone's always talking about wasting time. That has materialities in terms of traffic jams, air pollution, all of this stuff, but it's not what's really understood primarily. When someone says waste, they think about the kind of stuff that I've been writing about more in this project, which is, yeah, percentage-wise and weight-wise, the biggest forms of waste are domestic food waste. The way that food has a lot to do with the way that food comes into the city. A lot of food arrives quite directly from the countryside, bundled in traditional ways of wrapping food to keep it safe in transport. It requires a lot of use of leaves and that kind of stuff. So when a truck unloads a bunch of food, all of this extra organic material comes with it. So markets are one of the biggest sources of waste just because of the nature of the packaging. This is all quite, compostable, biodegradable stuff. And so there's a lot of the World Bank back in the early 2000s had this vision of composting, of inserting composting systems into the 14 biggest cities in Uganda, and it worked in 5 or 6, but didn't work in Kampala just because I think the scale was too much for these things, and there's too much physical distance between a lot of the farms where this compost could be used and the city itself. But in some of the smaller, cities that are closer to agrarian systems, there was this way to sort of square the circle of the and return nutrients to the land through it. But then also, like the traditional foods in central Uganda is a steamed plantain called the matoke that you have to peel, and that produces, like, by weight, about 50% of it ends up as waste. The peelings and stuff are quite heavy and organic, and again, that's quite biodegradable. There's a lot of projects in the city to turn those into biofuels. This is one of the ways that NGOs often interact with the waste stream, and through these kind of anti-poverty systems, livelihood systems, is trying to introduce these small-scale charcoal or bio-charcoal producing systems. So there's a bit in the book about the NGO efforts to do that, and the kind of work that goes into producing. In order to produce these things, you also have to produce community in all sorts of ways, in ways that then reproduce kind of hierarchies between a class of NGOs, NGO donors internationally, and then sort of people on the ground responsible for making community. And the economics of these projects are really quite precarious. At best, there's a few businesses that have managed to do it, but at the sort of small scale, it really relies on a lot of unpaid voluntary labor. And so they kind of peter out quite quickly when people realize that, yeah, you can produce biofuels out of this stuff, but it doesn't quite pay in the way that the story, the NGO story about it goes. But then, yeah, there's construction debris. Construction waste is a big source of waste in the city, but that's sort of outside of the purview of municipal waste. That's construction companies are ostensibly responsible for that. A lot of that gets dumped into wasteland, into wetlands to dry them out, and then sort of becomes the foundation for new rounds of construction. And then one of the other big waste streams that's quite interesting is medical waste and challenges around dealing with that, and the proliferation of clinics, small clinics around the city. There's an incinerator at the National Hospital in the capital. And so there's a whole parallel circulation of medical waste. And, ostensibly in theory, all of these things are kind of kept separate, but in practice, there's a lot of movement back and forth between them. But in terms of like weight and what sort of ends up at the landfill, it's mostly quite organic waste from foods. Although, yeah, the sort of material culture of the city has really transformed over the last 15 years with the kind of proliferation of plastics, a shift from Coke coming in glass bottles that would be collected over the sort of 5 years that I was doing between sort of my initial visit and the last time I visited Kampala. It's almost a total transformation away from glass to plastic as the sort of way that drinks are sold. A real growth in cans as the way that beer is sold, and just a huge bottled water industry that has a lot to do with sort of middle class anxieties around this water supply and problems of water connectivity in low income areas. So those, the statistics on this are all kind of somewhat out of date, but those are the kind of biggest sources of waste in the city. And I think that it has so much to do with sort of changing material composition of everyday life. And yeah, the plastics boom is really, I think, a big story in urban Africa that there's a few people working on, but I think there's a lot more work to be done on sort of tracing the kind of cultural histories of plastic as a sort of everyday substance.
Right. Professor Rukmini, yeah, go ahead.
You said, and I think I agree with you, that you questioned the kind of Mary Douglas view because, there's purity and danger, and then there being in-between creatures who are neither fish nor fowl, but like pigs are in between, because it didn't pay that kind of metaphoric explanation doesn't pay enough attention to the materiality of actual waste and production and so on. But I wanted to question the benignness, or at least I want to ask a question, not necessarily to question, the benignness of your view that the marable cranes are co-workers alongside the humans, and they have this kind of camaraderie, or at least, mutual, the human recognition of the animal as a co-worker. And I think that's, that's something which I would need more convincing of. It's one way for anthropologists to theorize it, but it's another, and one of your subjects did indeed say that, they help us and they take care of the dirtier things, whereas we can concentrate on other stuff. But that in itself introduces a hierarchy. And I'm wondering whether this view of co-working really would work in the kinds of societies which produce huge amounts of waste and, packaging and stuff. In fact, I'm always struck when I go to America as to how much garbage an average, that is wrapping and waste and all that, average American household produces compared to us in India. Now we are shifting over to this model of what you call inclusion and then disposal, because we have no other way of doing things. But if we think in terms of the metaphor of co-working with animals, that seems to kind of push, make us think of ourselves as essentially different societies from the capitalist societies of the West, who have all these other means of disposing things. We are supposed to have animals as co-workers. By we, I mean people in, Bengal, the small towns in Bengal, whereas this is not necessarily the case in the large capitalist centers of material production.
Yeah, there's a few responses to that. One is, I think I'm also amazed sort of when I have to take the rubbish out of my kitchen every few days, just quite how much of it there is. And I'm someone who thinks about this stuff kind of for a living. So I'm very skeptical of awareness as the way of getting around this problem of waste production in a kind of everyday space, because I'm quite aware of this, but here it is in my kitchen confronting me every few days anyway. The co-workers thing, so that's kind of my reading of it. I think there are a few people that I talked to there who talked about it in not exactly those terms, but as you said, sort of people who recognize that there's kind of separate niches that people occupy, and we get on with our work kind of in parallel. I think the biggest reaction of people working at the landfill was kind of indifference or just a bit annoyance. They get in the way. There wasn't that kind of sense of collegiality necessarily to it, and it was kind of they're just over there, they're doing their thing. I'm over here doing my thing, and that there's a kind of indifference to them that I think is. I think in the article I think maybe this is what civility actually means, is kind of a studied indifference and just getting on with things. But yeah, so I think there's actually a lot more unacknowledged animal, more than human co-workers in global North waste management systems, and there's a lot of interest in developing new ones. So there's a lot of there's a lot of research going into kind of discovering new kinds of bacteria that can eat plastics, for example, new ways of enrolling the more than human in managing precisely the kinds of inorganic waste that are constitutive of waste streams in places like the US and the UK. So there's a lot of attention to developing new ones, but then landfills are also like huge sites of multi-species action. It's often microscopic beings of all sorts. So I don't think it's quite true that there is a kind of there's animals in the waste stream, or there's animals in waste management in some places and not others. It's different species. It's different visually. There's different aesthetics to it, of course, but I think it's more the case that it's unacknowledged in. It's an unacknowledged relation for the most part. We have a lot of seagulls. I think I'm woken up by them every day, and they're the ones here. Sort of the closest equivalents we have are the sort of feast on food at landfills around here, and sort of litter and stuff. Although their ecological function I'm not quite as sure about, and there's some interesting work on what landfill managers actually have to do to keep them away. There's a really nice book called Trash Animals that has a chapter I think on this, about all of the work that goes into keeping seagulls away from a landfill, I believe in Toronto. So I think these kind of more than human waste stories are quite widespread. And I'm not sure that I'm sort of making a normative statement about like how things ought to be, but I think it's an interesting statement about the visual, the sort of visual and lived reality of what waste management in Kampala looks like currently.
When we read, I just have a small follow-up question. I work on Darwin, and particularly his book on his work on the expression of emotions in human beings and animals, which was spread across India, Africa, various countries. And we're reproducing some of those experiments. Now, Darwin speaks of disgust and also of having faces. So he's talking about emotions, and disgust is one of the basic emotions. And you mentioned quite strikingly that these birds. They are ungainly, they have no face, and therefore it's difficult to see them as part of an empathetic continuum or something of the sort.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question was to do with the notion of disgust, because waste involves a kind of natural, residue of evolutionary residue of disgust, and what disgust is. These kinds of so to animals we attribute no disgust, or do we attribute partial disgust to animals who have faces, like cats and dogs, or even little tigers and rabbits, who are closer to us and had less disgust? There's cognitive capacity for disgust to animals, especially ones that don't have faces, as in your thing. Because I'm thinking that, you could treat animals who don't have faces, who are disgusting looking, who are not attractive aesthetically, as capable of doing all sorts of stuff and, mucking about in garbage, whereas people who are closer to us facially, in terms of having faces and bodies like ours, are much less to be incorporated into this co-worker paradigm. Is that the case?
To think about that. Does the Darwin on disgust, how does he talk about birds? I'm curious, because he paid a lot of attention to birds in other things, but how did he talk about them there?
He did. He talked a lot about there being a continuum of emotions between animal species and human species, and a continuum of emotion between various cultures. So because he was, an evolutionary theorist, so he wanted to suggest that there was similarity. Now, when he talked about disgust, he tended to attribute it more to humans and less to animals, although he was looking at it across humans and animals, so that certain emotions seemed, and he has 16, including what he calls an emotional capacity to say yes or no, and because he treats that as empathy. And he doesn't seem to attribute disgust so much to birds and species away from us, but attributes aggression to both the humans and animals alike, for example. Mm-hmm. Swans, for example, he's talking about swans, he talks about aggression among swans. But when he talks about faraway birds, in trees and so on, he doesn't seem to attribute disgust. So I agree that different cultures will have different types of co-working between animals and humans. But I'm interested in the fact that you don't really attribute certain qualities to people, to species, which seem far away from us and therefore escape the theoretical network of co-working or whatever it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Aggressive swans does seem like that sort of locates him very much as a UK, as a Cambridge person, yes, in a lot of ways. So in a way, so you're asking a bit about the disgust felt by, not felt about, marabou storks. Do they feel disgust, or is that?
That's a good question. You feel disgust for them, but you attribute no disgust to them. They seek to be, enmeshed.
Mm-hmm. I think I was struck by actually how little feeling people. I asked a lot of people just sort of in the course of doing other. This wasn't the kind of central aspect of what the ethnographic project was about. It was something I realized was important and that I wanted to write about. And so I was talking to other people involved in the waste, about all their work and stuff, and I would always kind of throw in a question about whether or not they noticed marabou storks if they had any experiences with them. And very surprisingly, considering how present they were and like noticeable to me, a lot of people, they weren't sort of objects of a lot of strong, strong feelings or really even noticed by a lot of like people who worked, who like drove rubbish trucks, for example, or worked on the back of rubbish trucks picking up waste. You sort of encounter them in the course of their work, but just never really noticed or thought about them or didn't articulate that to me. So they weren't they're not an object of strong disgust in the way that a rat or dogs. I think they're maybe a little bit scarier. There's a sense of like scariness, but not that kind of. I think they're not necessarily associated with disease in the way that rats are. So I think that they haven't been kind of biomedicalized in quite the same way. But yeah, I think there is something to do with that they're not discussed. Maybe does seem to be something that's that it does seem like maybe more animals that are a bit more proximate or that have more face in that sense do maybe tend to figure more in that sense than these are slightly more alien that produce different kinds of affects. The thing that people did find disgusting was their waste, the birds droppings themselves, and that was sort of the thing that was the substance that always sort of triggered people and made them want to get rid of the birds rather than the birds themselves.
Thank you.
I just had a related question. When you were talking about parasites and about the patchy ecologies that are constructed within them, I was thinking about whether, how is it really waste for these animals and for these other people who are working in these spaces, or is it something else?
Rubbish, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, is it really seen as rubbish or waste or garbage by these beings in these parasites? Because I remember you using Ceres to further that concept. And Ceres, when he talks about parasites, he doesn't just define them as being parasitic. He also describes them in a number of ways. So I was thinking about whether to these people and to these animals in the parasites, is it really waste, or is that perhaps an anthropocentric narrative that we are using to make sense of that space?
It could be in terms of whether or not marabou storks themselves have a concept of waste. I think, yeah, it might be anthropocentric to apply it to them. For them, I think it's this is what sort of attracts them to the city, right? The city is full of this quite nutritionally rich edible stuff maybe they shouldn't be eating, but is all mixed in together. So I think that's not necessarily, the stuff that the municipal government calls waste, that people living in a neighborhood called rubbish, is sort of what attracts them to Kampala and what sort of sustains them in the city. So I think for them it's very much food. And then I think, this is kind of the big push that a lot of environmental and sanitation NGOs in the city are doing, is these kind of waste to resources or waste to wealth kind of campaigns of trying to change the mindset. Even, actually, the municipal governments adopted this too, so this idea of changing the mindset of people around rubbish, recognizing opportunities in it and promoting recycling, promoting things like the biomass briquette, charcoal production, sort of seeing the possible reuse value that exists in waste stream as a way of combating the garbage crisis and managing the amount of garbage in the city. One way to do that is to make people see the value in it, and then cultivate practices and infrastructures that enable them to harness that value. I think when that's pitched primarily in terms of mindset, it doesn't work quite as well, because people can see that, but then not have much ability to do anything with it. But then when there's sort of infrastructures in place, when the systems to capture plastics, which is the big thing that people are collecting, it does sort of extract huge amounts from it. So I think there's a way that this is what actually a student of Mary Douglas's, Michael Thompson, has a book called Rubbish Theory, that's about the sort of degradation of value and the reproduction of value. And waste is the kind of zero moment in these cycles that enables the reinvestment into value. So objects sort of decline and decline and decline to this 0 point of waste and then become reinvested. And so he talks about gentrification in these terms, or the way that goods become like a good, like a consumer good will sort of lose value and then be reinvested with value and become an antique. So for him, waste is this always transitory category in the kind of social life of objects. And I think that's what a lot of the environmental NGOs are trying to produce, that kind of thing as a way of managing rubbish in the city, is producing new kind of futures for garbage so that it could become something else. Yeah, I think the waste category, it's always kind of relational and relative as to who's viewing it and what they're wanting to do with it, whether or not they. So yeah, having said that, there is a kind of common sense stuff that people can, people generally know what you're talking about when you're talking about garbage in Kampala. There's not a lot of miscommunication about that.
I think it's like nearly time, but maybe if you have time, we can just take Shruti's question. And I think Anu also has something to say. Is that okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay, Shruti, go ahead.
Thank you. So just to tell you a little bit about my work, it is to do with the everyday lives of cattle and bovines in urban Indian cities. And I just wanted to share with you how I have been thinking about waste and non-humans at these sites. So what you typically see is that most of the bovines who are left astray during the day between the two milking periods, they find their way to the neighborhood dump. And these sites become sites not just to forage on, not just to consume the waste, but also as sites to sort of rest, ruminate, sleep, and so on. So one of the ways that I'm also trying to think of these mobilities is, does this garbage dump, does the site become a sort of phantom or ghost commons? And I largely think of it this way because it speaks of some kind of an erasure of these grazing lands or erstwhile commons. And this largely comes from, of course, the urbanization and, urban process and the notions associated with these kind of unmanicured landscapes in a sort of growing capital city, especially. And in that sense, the garbage dump becomes a site of, commoning or even a more than human commoning, because you don't just find cattle there, but you find other kinds of animals as well. And of course, you have people scavenging as well. So one of the things is that does the non-human then through whether the bovine geography or the mobilities and movements kind of invents certain commons, be it, phantom or be it informal, but largely deriving from the lacuna in the logic of the state, the larger planning, the vision of the state. And in some sense, so I'm wondering if one can draw parallels with the stock. And I mean, I'm not sure if, waste is something that they have always been foraging on or they have always been found at these dump sites. But is that something one can sort of think about is what I was wondering.
That's really interesting. In a way, I think there isn't the kind of history of storks as an animal that go to pasture or that are kind of involved in sort of, they're not an agrarian animal in quite the same way. So I think there's a slightly different relation to human property regimes and the kinds of, that constitute a commons. But I think I think it's a quite useful way to think about some of these wastelands as sites of commoning, where there is this kind of possibility, and I think speaks exactly to as you're saying, sort of changes due to urbanization, kind of lacuna in urban planning, places that can be recaptured in unauthorized ways, but that aren't sort of free. I'm not sure if this is the case in the sites that you're studying, but in Kampala and at the landfill, for example, thinking about it as a commons, I think can be quite interesting. But that also doesn't mean it's sort of a free-for-all, right? There's norms, there's established patterns of sharing, rights and access is negotiated in all sorts of ways that exceed the concept of private property, right? No one sort of, other than the municipality who claims it as a kind of site of government, like this is, our land and we're in control of it. And then there's a private contracting firm that has a contract to manage the waste. So for them, the property isn't so much the land itself, but the contract over management. but the material stuff itself is kind of at this, this kind of Richard Thompson 0 point of value, I think is precisely around common, like that's where some commons happens, and all sorts of interesting things happen with how people do property and rights and access at those that I think are really interesting. I'm not sure. I think that part of what enables the storks to inhabit that is that this kind of up for grabsness, and that they are participating in that commonness. I think the other thing about commons is that that's where kind of primitive accumulation happens, and these quickly become new frontiers of investment and redevelopment. Waste becomes a site for managing, for waste management becomes privatized, and so waste itself as a sort of problem becomes privatized and passed on to private garbage contractors or international waste management firms, for example. The stuff in the waste is getting privatized as sort of commercial recycling takes off, right? There's all the land in sort of in neighborhood dump sites, and where wetlands are getting filled in and stuff. These are frontiers for new kinds of investment in real estate development and stuff. So I think there's this way that I think thinking about them as commons is really useful, but as a way of thinking about what's coming next in the process of frontier making and capture of the value that's happening there. So I think the question is, the sort of political question is how to sort of retain and build on commons, rather than sort of this constant struggle that I've sort of witnessed of just kind of effort to cling on to them as they emerge. In these kind of this very, very precarious lacuna, that, as you call them. So yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I likewise look forward to seeing more of your work as it comes out.
Thank you. Anu?
Thanks, Susan. Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much. This has been a really a great session with so many questions and delving into so many aspects of your work within this 1 hour that we've had. I was reminded very, very often while reading your article of certain features in the urban Indian landscape involving street dogs. You know, different animals, of course, different settings, but there is clearly a connection with waste, because the same connection is made. There are street dogs because there are open garbage disposal mechanisms and waste piles for that matter. The other thing that I have thought of was when Rukmini was asking you whether there is really this notion of co-workers between the Marabu stocks and the people who work with the garbage, among which the stocks also forage, because something similar has also been explored about street dogs and waste workers in India, who are also somehow a part of this informal waste management thing. There is a garbage truck or something, a municipal thing, organized sector, a garbage disposal mechanism that is at work. And then there is this informal part of it, people who come with these bags or these sort of large sacks slung over their shoulders, and they sift through the garbage where they find it, and they take away whatever can be resold. And street dogs know these people know the street dogs, and there is usually a really good relationship between them, which has also been explored in research. I'm thinking of Kritika Srinivasan's article where she talks about the example of Chennai and the street dogs there and the waste workers in the city. So the people she interviewed did not go so far, from what I remember, as to think of the dogs as their co-workers, but they did acknowledge, just like the people you spoke to in Kampala did, that A, the dogs were their friends, B, they sense some kind of a shared vulnerability because people hated the waste workers, thought of them as unclean, thought of them as suspicious, thought of them as people that shouldn't be there in a modern, clean, beautiful city. And they thought similarly of the street dogs. And so that sort of created a bond between them, being unwanted, being looked upon as suspicious and unclean. But they also admitted that, that the fact that the dogs ate whatever was edible in the garbage meant that they could do their jobs easier. So without, I think, verbalizing it as some sort of a we are working together, there was some sort of a gratitude expressed towards the street dogs. without suggesting that the dogs do it to help them, but simply as a byproduct of the dogs eating from the garbage, that the task of the waste progress becomes easier. The other thing that I had been struck by was the fact that the marabou stalks have not been demonized there, the way dogs have been in India. Here, of course, the risk of rabies is always invoked. But rabies is not the only risk that is invoked in building up the narrative around the menace that one associates with street dogs. Even diseases that dogs carry, but which are not communicable to human populations, are evoked as something that people should beware of, and that's why there shouldn't be street dogs around, and that's why one needs to get rid of them. I am surprised that nothing of the sort has emerged with the birds, with the caribou, with the marabou storks. How do you see that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in part they're kind of scary and weird, but there's not the kind of quite the possibility of biting. And I wonder how much like it's the dog as a, yeah, I think there seems to be some kind of difference about like the kind of damage that they could do to you. That's maybe like they're not quite as scary, and I think they're not quite as present when they're walking around. They're on landfills. They might cross, but they're not in neighborhoods. They don't sort of transect space in quite the same way. They're in kind of marginal spaces where a dump site or a wetland or something like that is, and you'll see them. But I think because they fly, you just don't see them crossing around the city as much. Like when you see them, as if you look up and you'll see like a huge, a dozen sort of circling around, or their mobilities just sort of take them out of everyday life of neighborhoods rather than through them. So I think there's perhaps a lot less of that kind of interaction, and that they're maybe easier to not notice. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the people who do demonize them are the people who live where they nest, and who deal with waste is their kind of primary. I know I keep coming back to this, but I think that's the primary thing. But they're also coded in this way that you're saying is kind of unmodern, or out of place in the modern city, and the place where they have big the trees. When they nest in smaller trees and make big nests, there can be a quite intense smell around, like the chicks and the waste and everything like that. So they can have a quite strong smell as part of it, but they're not quite as fearsome as yeah. But they're also equally, I think, like I don't think anyone would say like we're friends with them in the way that you could be with stray dogs. They're a bit too weird maybe for that.
Thank you.
I think that about wraps it up. Thanks a lot, Jacob, for talking to us and discussing your work with us. I think the book's coming out sometime in December. I can't.
That's the plan.
Yeah, I can't wait to read the rest of the book. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all so much for these really engaging questions. This has been really fun, and I'm very, very grateful for the chance to talk about this stuff with you. And look forward to hearing. Please do share work with me if you're. I'd love to see more of what you're all working on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.